Hi, everybody. Welcome again to our channel, our Scientology Stories, Peeling the Onion. And my name is Mark Fisher, and we've got a special interview for you again today. And before we get started, I'm going to introduce my co-host, Janis Gillham Grady. Hey, Janis, how you doing?
Aloha, Mark.
Aloha.
G'day, everyone. Nice to have you all with us. We
Absolutely.
are continuing to enjoy doing these interviews and giving you lots of little bits and pieces of the history of our lives and Scientology and all that groovy stuff so that you can feel a part of it.
That's right. And then we've got a returning guest, right, Janis?
Yes, we do. I'd like to introduce my good friend, Ken Urquhart.
Hi, Janis. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Ken.
Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. It's real good.
We've been enjoying doing these interviews with you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoy them too.
Good.
Absolutely. Well, we want to start, and we're going to show the interviews that you did before, but we found this picture of you. Janis did, right, Janis?
Yeah, it was actually just sent to me from Jill Steinberg. It was a picture of Ken at her wedding to Leon.
And who was in the pictures, Janis?
On the left is David Mayo, and then with that big grin on his face, that's Ken Urquhart. And next to him is Frankie Freeman, and next to him is Captain Bill Robertson.
Wow. Do you remember about this? Is in the 1970s, right?
This would have been 1973 because I was on leave of absence when Jill and Leon got married.
Okay, great. Bring back memories, Ken?
I don't remember the event, no. I don't know why I was smiling. There were very few photos of me smiling.
Well, you got busted in this one.
Yeah. Life was real serious in those days.
Yes.
Well, our viewers may know Ken, and if not, we did several interviews with him. This is part one of our interview series with Ken. He was LRH's butler and assistant at St. Hill Manor in England, and then eventually became his personal communicator. And this was part one. And then this is part two. We broke it down when he was on the flagship Apollo and in Clearwater. And then the third interview that we did was about the creation of the Rehabilitation Project Force, and Ken goes into detail about that. So all three of these videos are available on our channel if you haven't seen them, and we have them grouped together as a playlist so they're easy to find. And then, of course, this is going to be part four of our interview with Ken. And Janis, why don't you go ahead and tell everybody what we're going to be talking about here today first?
We're going to be talking about the Standing Order number 1, which is, most people know it as the SO1 line. And that is where all communications to L. Ron Hubbard are received by him. And so many Scientologists would write to Ron and they would get answers. And we're going to go into how that whole line worked and various changes to it over the years.
Yeah, as a public person, I can remember as a teenager, I mean, there was a box in the organization where you could write to Ron and you would get a letter back. And I actually believe that I got a letter back from Ron, and it was always great as a public person to receive those. This is the Standing Order number 1 line from L. Ron Hubbard. All mail addressed to me shall be received by me, L. Ron Hubbard. And go ahead, Janis, or Ken. What do you want to talk about? Janis, go ahead and lead the discussion on this, okay?
Okay. Well, I actually remember as a messenger working directly with Hubbard, in the mornings when he would get up, he would go to his office and sit down, and Ken would have had different folders put on his desk in his in basket of different kind of traffic for Hubbard to handle. And the last folder was the SO1 folder of letters in there for him to actually read what the person wrote, the proposed answer, and then he would sit there and sign those. And this was done in the earlier years. And now, I've been talking with Ken, and it was Ken who would make up those answers. And so let me turn it over to Ken to describe that.
Okay. No, I was actually on the SO1 line at St. Hill earlier, if you want me to talk about that.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
please.
When did it start and how did it work out? Here's St. Hill here.
Well, I became an LRH Com in 65, LRH Com St. Hill, and I had no experience in the SO1 line before that, but I found myself receiving the local SO1s, and I had to compose a reply, type it up, and I had to send it to Phil Carino, who was LRH Com worldwide, who would then send it on to LRH. I just learned typing, and my typing was usually a bit of a mess, but I don't remember LRH ever sending it back because, I'd made a little mistake and rubbed it out, and it didn't look too good. He didn't seem to mind. There were not a lot of them. There wasn't a heavy traffic.
Right.
Then I became LRH Com worldwide in early 65. Philip Carino was demoted. And then I got a lot of letters from all over the UK. I also got a lot of letters from LRH Com throughout the world. And during that time I was on that post, LRH was in Africa. And I sent the answers that I had prepared or accepted from other LRH Coms into Irene Thrupp, LRH's secretary. And what she did with them, I never asked. I was too busy. I had so much to do. I was overwhelmed. I just got them off my desk and into Irene, and I got on with something else. But there are two things I remember that stand out. And one was that I would get a letter about twice a week from one particular person. It would be 18 or 19 pages of long paper, handwritten, both sides. And I quickly found out that this person was not quite right. And for some reason had to put a whole lot of what looked like rubbish on paper and send it to Ron Hubbard. So I just quickly dead filed them. The other interesting thing that happened was I got a letter that was enclosed inside a different envelope. It was addressed, the inner one was addressed to LRH, and with it was a note saying, if you are not LRH, don't open this envelope addressed to him. It should go to him because I will know when the letter is open, I will know who is looking at it. And I'm thinking, so much for that. I have to open it. It's my job. So I opened it, and there was a flash of energy, very definite and very real. So something was in that letter that was not completely physical. And I guess the guy who had originated it had put some kind of spell in there, and he must have had some glimpse of me in the response, and I guess he knew it wasn't LRH. But anyway, that was strange.
So what happened? Did he call you out on it?
No, I never heard.
Oh, okay.
Was it like a voodoo spell, like where you like all of a sudden you started walking with a limp or something like that?
No.
What, did you propose an answer to that letter?
I think I must have.
Okay.
And
I just want to say it's not unusual at all for celebrities to have people, answer their mail for them. But LRH would actually, at those days, he would look at the letters and the proposed answers, right, before he signed them. Is that how it worked?
So far as I know, yes. Now, when I was LRH Com St. Hill and sending in my SO1 responses for him to sign, I never saw him sign any. But they came back and the signatures looked like his. And I would have sworn that he had seen them and signed them.
And when did you notice the volume of letters increasing? And was there a time point where they started getting so big that they were hard to keep up with or handle?
During that time when I was at St. Hill, no, not particularly. They did when I was on the ship, yes. And that's
Okay.
one reason. Whoops. Are you
We got
still
you.
there?
Yeah, we have you.
I've gone black. My
Oh,
screen is
remember,
black.
move your mouse.
Yeah, move your mouse.
All right.
We can still see you.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. I pressed
Yeah.
enter.
I forgot to remind you about that.
Thanks. Yeah. So the flood got so big on the ship that's one reason why he told me to set up the SO1 unit to handle the traffic, because it was a lot for him to handle, and it was a huge amount for me. So we can go forward now to the time I was on the ship, if you like. I can
Go
tell
right
you.
ahead. Yeah,
Yes.
carry on.
Well, we would be at sea. We could come into a port, and we'd pick up the mail.
Yeah.
And whichever office, I think it was usually in New York, collected all of the mail that was to come to the ship, and they sent a courier with the mail to the port we were arriving at. So I would get, one of the things I'd get would be the collected SO1 mail from all over the world, which would come in through New York. And a lot of it was not responded to. So I made it my habit. The first thing I did after we got into port and I got all this mail, it was to get it off my desk. So I would write up. Somebody's at my door.
Oh, just ignore them.
Okay.
Maybe it's
So
the person with the spell. Maybe the person with the spell is coming to haunt you.
Yeah. It's probably delivery. I would read the letter and compose the reply and attach it, my response to the letter, send it down to Joyce, and she would type it up on his letterhead, and it would come up for him to look at and sign.
Now, just so everybody knows, Joyce was Ken's secretary.
Yes.
And she was the LRH PersCom secretary. So LRH Personal Communicator secretary. And she was actually the mother of my fellow messenger, Claire, who we call Poppy. And her mother was Joyce Popham. And she was married to Des Popham, who was Hubbard's transportation in charge. And he took care of LRH's cars and motorbikes.
And Arthur.
Yeah.
Yes.
He was the surrogate dad for Arthur.
Yes. And Joyce was a wonderful support to me. I don't know. I don't think I could have managed without her.
Yes. You know, they were late. Des was a lord and Joyce was a lady by title.
Well, I can believe it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when this is on the ship, you were getting all this mail from New York or wherever, and then you all would sort through it. And when did you have to start setting up a unit of people to deal with the volume of mail?
That must have been either in 72 before he left for Tangier and then went to New York, or after he came back. I just cannot remember exactly when it was. That's a blur.
Right.
But there's one funny story to do with that period. The traffic had got so great that instead of writing out the reply, I wrote my own version of shorthand. I abbreviated every word, but Joyce was smart enough to always know what I was meant. And I knew she would. I didn't have to explain it to her. She picked up on it right away, but then she and Des went away for a week or two. And she found a replacement, an older woman, whom I won't name because the story's a little bit against her. But But both Joyce and I forgot to tell this lady that she would be getting my responses in this kind of shorthand, and she had to write out the words. So I sent down my first batch, was maybe 15 or 20 SONs, and they all came back for LRH's signature in my shorthand. So,
Ken, what were the type of requests, or what were the letters mainly about that you dealt with from the public?
well, there was always a lot of thank yous of one kind or another. There were wins and successes. There would be occasional reports that were really kind of complaints that this or that had happened and it shouldn't have in an org. There was a fair amount of what I would call crew SO1s. That was just personal notes from the crew that came up to LRH, and those were handled as an SO1. There was one of them that was, I should mention because it's closely connected with a historical event on the ship, and that was a letter from Sue Meister.
So let me just say who Sue Meister was.
Right.
Sue Meister was the woman who committed suicide on the ship using a gun when we were in Safi, Morocco. And that's a whole nother story we will cover, but this is why Ken is bringing it up and who it is.
Right. She wrote up a note to LRH, and it was more or less a petition to be allowed to leave the ship. And at that time, the attitude towards those requests was, don't grant them right off. So I composed a reply. I forget what I said exactly, but I didn't have LRH signing a statement saying, yes, it's okay for you to go. And he signed it. It went into him and he signed it. And then after she had done away with herself, so unfortunately and unhappily, he was investigating what was going on. And I think I told him that she had sent up this letter and he had signed it. And his response was, you should have told me that she was asking to leave. Well, that told me that he wasn't reading the letters.
Right. That's what I was just going to say.
There were some that he wasn't reading, he's just signing them.
Yeah, he's just signing them just to get them off his plate, off his desk.
Which I kind of suspected, but he was the evidence. So then I made sure that any time an SON went in with something kind of important, that there was a little note attached to it, drawing his attention to it. But I think then at that time when he was investigating and found out about this SO1 from Susan Meister, he told me to grant these petitions, these requests, just to go ahead and grant them.
Right. And I believe, Ken, it was after that whole thing with Sue Meister happened that he then put out the order that anybody wanting to leave, they had to have them routed off the ship within 24 hours of their request.
Very likely.
Yes.
How so what would you do with letters that you got that you didn't know how to answer, or was it easy to figure out what to do, or would you like put them aside in your pending basket while you investigated or looked into things? How did that go?
The SO1 handling was never heavy. If it required follow-up, that would be stated or hinted and just left. I mean, the person who had written the letter was acknowledged, and if not involved in the follow-up, wasn't involved. There was one time I had a letter from a couple in England, and these were people I'd actually known before I went to St. Hill. He was an Irishman, she was English, they married, and here was a letter on my desk from the wife. They had had a little boy, I think it was a little boy, and this little boy had a heart condition, which she named and described, and she asked if L. Ron Hubbard had any advice that would help the child with this condition. I had no clue, so I sent it to him and asked him, what should we say? And he composed the answer, and it was typed up. And I don't remember exactly what medical advice he gave, if any, but he gave her, I remember I was moved at how empathetic and almost sympathetic he was in his reply, because there wasn't much that could be done apparently. But he really, he must have made her feel really acknowledged as a very caring mother.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So you didn't have any problem. You could actually go in if there was something you wanted to discuss with him about a letter that came in. He didn't mind talking to you or making suggestions.
I never walked into his office to ask him about or speak to him about something.
Okay.
No, I sent that one in his traffic. That was part.
Yeah, you always waited till he called you. Otherwise,
Yes.
it was just the traffic. Yeah.
Well, there was one time, I think the messenger might have been you, Janis, and I'd said to the messenger on duty outside his research room, I said, can you tell the Commodore I need to speak to him now, please? And that was to tell him about Susan Meister's death.
Right. Yes, that was me.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Now, I remember times where he would read the SO1 letters.
Yes.
And he disagreed with the answer, and he would cross it out and write in his own answer.
Yes.
And I believe those were mailed that way with his handwritten corrections. They weren't retyped, or were they retyped?
As far as I remember, they were retyped.
Oh, okay.
Now, one change he made, which people should know of, and that is, I think around 1970, he started signing his SO1 answers with a green felt tip pen. That became his habit.
Yeah, I remember getting SO1 replies to me, and they were always in green ink, his signature. Yeah.
That was his. He did that, and very often he would write a line or two under his signature with that same green pen. So you can be very sure that a letter signed in green and with an added note below in green is completely authentic.
Right. Okay. Good to know.
Ken, did you ever get any amusing requests or anything that you remember?
I don't remember.
Any love notes or anything like that written to Hubbard?
No.
But he did used to get little drawings from kids. The parents would send the drawings that the kid would have done for Ron.
Yeah. To tell you the truth, I don't remember.
Okay.
Right.
And then when did he stop seeing, or like I remember when I joined the Sea Org in 1976, there was an SO #1 unit in the Clearwater building. But it was confidential. You literally couldn't go in there. I mean, it was a closed door. You know, I still believed at that time that Hubbard was writing to me because I was a public person. But once you get there, the cat's out of the bag that the SO1s are being answered and signed by somebody else, right?
Yeah.
So when did that change? When you guys came off the ship, or what happened?
It changed on the ship. It must have been, as I said, either in 72 before he left to go to Tangier, or when he got back in 73. And I'm sorry, I just don't remember.
Okay.
Yeah, so during that time period when we moved to Tangier, Ken and Joyce were in Lisbon and we were in Tangier. So you guys just handled that yourselves with Joyce signing the LRH signature, rather because they couldn't get it to LRH.
Right.
And then in 73, when he came back, I believe you guys started sending them certain ones back to him to sign, but not all of them.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Also, didn't they do a summary, like an annual summary or a quarterly summary of the letters that he was getting in terms of positive, negative, things like that, or no?
I never did that.
Nothing like that. Okay.
Never even thought about it.
But they did encourage more letters to be written because they needed to get their stats up.
It was
They wanted liberty.
They wanted liberty, so it was their job to encourage people to write to Ron, and they were still telling him that he was getting those letters when they were the ones, the SO1 unit were the ones answering them all.
Yes. I'm
Right.
sorry about that, but that's true.
Okay. Janice, is there anything else we want to cover on this subject before we go on?
No, because I don't even remember any SO1 letters ever coming near him after 76.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can?
No.
Right.
No.
All right, well, we want to move on to the next subject, Ken. We've been very blessed to have your input on our different interviews and your time with L. Ron Hubbard, both as first starting out, working as his butler and then his personal communicator, and as an auditor, you got trained and all that sort of stuff. And we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about L. Ron Hubbard, the man who you met and knew and worked with personally, and then what are your impressions now after all these years and all that, and we'd like to get your opinion. Let me ask you before we start on that, do you remember the last time that you actually saw or talked to L. Ron Hubbard?
Yes, I do, very clearly. That was in Dunedin.
Uh-huh.
Do you want the story now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. We were in Dunedin. I was in very bad I was in great disfavor with L. Ron Hubbard at the time.
Uh-huh.
That was very obvious. But he called me into his office one day, I think it was in March, and I sat down in front of his desk. He was quite, I would say, kind of lugubrious, like he was heavy. He was not friendly. And he said he was leaving for a while, didn't tell me where or for how long. And then he told me, as he usually did when he was leaving wherever we were, he said, keep an eye on things.
Uh-huh.
And then he paused. And out of the silence came these words: "You are too much of a gentleman."
Hmm.
And I'm sitting there and I'm hearing this. And my first thought is, with all the things that he could throw at me, and there were many,
Yeah.
why is he choosing this? And there are so many, he's obviously against me, and he's known me for so long. He knows my folder inside out, my case folder.
Yeah.
There's so much he could throw at me that would really hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, he's throwing this strange off-the-wall comment, "You're too much of a gentleman." And at first, I thought he was referring to the replies that I would write up for him to sign off when the international executive management sent up their weekly report to him about the international stats. They would send a long telex saying this and that and the other was happening, and I would compose a reply for him to respond with. And I was never really very rough with them. I mean, it wasn't in my nature to be as rough as he could be. So I thought he was referring to that. But later on, I thought, no, maybe there was other things going on. But at any rate, I was completely amazed that he was obviously ending our personal relationship on a very weak note, a very indecisive note.
Mm-hmm.
It left so much hanging. I was very surprised because I expected, I'd always known that one of these days he would get rid of me. And I hadn't known, of course, we all saw how he had got rid of other people in a hurry. People up on the prom deck, his staff aides, they'd found themselves in the bilges within minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I expected the same kind of thing to happen to me, but it didn't. It was a very damn squib when it came. So that was my last meeting with him.
And that was just before he left to Washington, D.C. with Kimmer and Michael.
That was the day he left.
Yes. So, yeah, from there he went to D.C. and then he flew out to Los Angeles.
Yes.
And then we ended up with the base in La Quinta and then later moved to Hemet.
Yes.
And Ken was left behind in Clearwater that whole time.
Yes.
And
you
Ken,
know, but,
go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Alan Voss was with them in D.C.
Right.
I think he was on the domestic, a steward of some kind, but I don't remember. But I knew Alan and Heidi Voss after we'd all left. They were very kind and very hospitable to me many, many times. And I remember Alan saying to me that with all the fuss that LRH had made on the ship and at Dunedin about the food and the service and so on, he was living in a furnished flat and eating in restaurants and with never a complaint.
And that's what Gail told me too, because Gail was sent there at 19 years old to be a cleaner, and she just dusted any old way she felt like it, and they all would go to the movies and sit around, and he never complained about dust or food, but he did when there was a lot of people around.
Right. I remember him complaining that they were putting glass in his food.
Well, you then continued, though, after you last saw him as his personal communicator in Clearwater for some time after that, right?
I stayed on the post, but I did virtually nothing.
Uh-huh.
Because there was very little going through you, right? They're more like going direct to him, and then at the other end, the messengers were the ones handling the traffic that was going to him.
Well, yes, but the messengers were also very busy in Clearwater.
Yes.
Very busy.
Do you remember, you probably do, John McGinley? I mean, I remember he became LRH PersCom, I guess after you, right? Wasn't he your deputy or what was his position?
He was my log clerk. He kept my LRH com log.
And then he actually took over when you were taken off, right? As LRH PersCom. Because I remember I had dealings with John when he was LRH PersCom in Clearwater. L. Ron Hubbard set up the Flag Land Based Coordination Council, and the PersCom was made the chairman of it. And the COs of the different organizations in LRH comms, we had to meet on a routine basis to deal with things at the Flag Land Base. So that's where I met John.
Yeah, just so people know, CO is a commanding officer. So you're talking about someone who's in charge of an organization. But the PersCom log was a log of the different LRH orders that were being chased up for compliance. And that is what John McGinley was doing for you, right, Ken?
Administratively, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But John was a great guy. And then he eventually, I had a relationship with him then when we were on that coordination council, along with Fran Harris and the major executives of the organizations. But then he eventually came up to the Gold Base, and he was a good friend of mine. He actually was one of the groomsmen in my wedding, and he was a great guy. Anyway,
yeah, very nice guy, very nice guy.
Okay. And so now, okay, so that was the last time you saw him. So, you then became an auditor, right? You were in the rehabilitation project for us, and then you became an auditor, and then eventually you left the C organization. We talked about that in your earlier videos. And then you delivered auditing outside of the Scientology organization for some time. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, I
Okay.
did.
Okay. So what is your opinion about Hubbard? And, because obviously, he did a lot of good, in a lot of people's eyes, but then, there's lots of complaints about him in terms of, Scientology going south. And we'd like to get your feelings and your viewpoints on that.
Okay, well, I'll try and keep it brief and concise and clear. I was, from my very first introduction to Scientology, which was, I think I mentioned, 14 hours of group processing over one weekend at the London org, I was extremely impressed with the work that he was producing. Very, very impressed.
Mm-hmm.
I thought there's been nothing like this ever. And that respect increased over the years. I heard nothing particularly bad about him. I mean, I'm not saying there wasn't anything bad that could have been said about him, but
Right.
it never reached my ears.
Mm-hmm.
There was very little bad about him said around the London org, everybody seemed to adore him. I went to a couple of public lectures that he gave around 1959 in London. And again, he was a very impressive speaker, very convincing, sounded very authentic, and he sounded very helpful. And also, rather funnily enough, in view of what I said about his and my last meeting, he was very gentlemanly.
Mm-hmm.
Then I had some very good auditing. I had some very useful training. I wasn't able to do the professional training at London Royal because I wasn't qualified. And it was just as well I didn't, because I was not in good shape. But I had enough training and some very, very good wins out of auditing that when the time came for me to take the opportunity to serve him at St. Hill, I was very much a follower. And my respect for him grew tremendously as I associated with him every day in my humble position as his servant. But he was, in those days, he was a very, very good friend to me.
Right.
Now, he teased me a lot, but he said very early on, after he teased me about something or other, he said, "But we only tease our friends."
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but knowing him and working for him and knowing that I was doing a good enough job to take some of the load off his plate, because he told me I was doing that,
Mm-hmm.
although I had done that. And I saw him every day, and I very rarely got any indication that my performance was not good enough.
Right.
Right.
So he was letting me know that I was producing satisfactorily for him. And I had so much respect for him that I felt that this approval of his was huge for me personally.
Right.
And I've never, ever forgotten that.
Right.
I don't think he went out of his way at all to be kind to me. It was just the way he was naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a couple of times I stepped out of line and he slapped me down immediately and quickly and terminatedly without making me feel awful. But the iron fist was very obvious, could be very obvious, despite the thick velvet glove.
Right.
So he was obviously, he was nobody, he wasn't anybody that took a fool gladly. So knowing that about him, and that he was always friendly and I would say respectful towards me,
Right.
gave me a lot of, it boosted my self-confidence tremendously, and boy, did I need it.
Mm-hmm.
I've never forgotten that, and I never will.
No,
what?
No, finish what you were saying. Sorry.
That's not okay. We actually had, I didn't realize until much, much later that we had he and I established a very good personal relationship. And this indicated itself a couple of times after I went over into the organization. After I was LRHCOM worldwide and I got demoted. I got demoted on a very spurious cause. When he left St. Hill to go to Africa, he said to me, "Don't let anybody know that I've gone." And he said what he always said at that particular time. He said, "When the cat's away, the mice do play." So he thought that the staff would get up to mischief if they knew he wasn't there keeping an eye on them. So I followed this policy as best I could, although it was very obvious to everybody that he was no longer present at St. Hill, because you couldn't be at St. Hill without feeling his presence, even if you didn't see him. He filled the whole place. Anyway, everybody knew he'd gone, and I'm keeping up this pretense that he was still there. And then we had the first clear, and then the other clears fairly quickly followed, and he would be told by telex, by the clearing course office, that so and so is clear number 3. Pam Piercy was clear number 3, and 4 and 5 and so on, and he would send a telex back to me. He would say, "Issue congratulations to Pam Piercy, clear 3." And I saw this and I thought, well, I can't issue this as a telex, because that's saying to everybody that he's not here. He wouldn't issue a telex from his desk.
Right.
Well, so I just changed it as though he had written it at his desk at St. Hill. And I just said, took his brief telex message and made it into a little more usual sentence. And I got a court of ethics for altering his communication.
And he's the one who ordered the court of ethics on you?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. Meanwhile, he was in South Africa, and he had told LRHCOM Africa, a woman, that's name I forget, he told her, "It's okay to let everybody know I'm here." He hadn't told me that. So that was an indication of how he could handle things.
Yeah.
Anyway, I accepted it because I was glad to be off that post.
Right.
Let me ask you a question. Oh, go ahead, Janis.
I was going to ask you, Ken, during that time that you were his butler and you were with him all that time, serving him meals, setting up his room to go to bed, or, when he got up and so forth, did you see him drinking alcohol or doing anything like that would not be acceptable?
Never.
Never.
No.
Even on a casual basis, drinking wine at a dinner party?
He didn't have parties. He had one party when I was there, and that was to entertain 2 men from the local bank. And I had to put on a dinner for them. Reg Sharp was present, and Jenny, his girlfriend. And he told me the next morning that he'd got a loan of £25,000, and he was very happy about that.
Okay.
And he also sent me, he had also sent me during the night a little note and said that was quite a feast.
Good.
For
And then later when
no
we
wine.
were on
No wine.
when we were on the Apollo, do you
Yes.
remember him drinking?
Not one drop of alcohol did I
Okay.
ever see get into his mouth. Not one drop.
Right.
And
Yeah,
he never ever, what?
I only remember him doing it after we'd been at sea and it was cold and wet, and he went down and he took a swig of brandy or whiskey or something like that.
Right. Right.
But otherwise, I didn't see him drinking.
No. And he had
Okay.
a bar. He had that bar full of bottles right next to his office.
Yeah.
I never saw him go in there.
No, neither did I.
No.
I was going to ask you a kind of question because after you you left the post of the LRH personal communicator in Clearwater and you were in the rehabilitation project force, and then you became an auditor. You actually did technical training at that point in time, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then you actually you audited for many years, first in the Sea Org and then outside the Sea Org. Did becoming an auditor and actually learning how to deliver the technology, did that change your appreciation of L. Ron Hubbard or the technology, because you'd already worked for him on the administrative side or his Butler side and that type of thing? How did that change your viewpoint about L. Ron Hubbard and his technology and what was happening?
It increased it. I had seen him work technically. I'd seen him work as a tech terminal. I'd seen him work as the source of technology in developing new rundowns. I'd seen him work as a CS. He had me sit with him as he CS'd the crew folders. And as he sat and CS'd them, he would talk to me about what he was looking for, what he was finding, and what he was going to do about it. So he taught me a huge amount about tech just from those casual comments. And one of the things that struck me most, well, there were two things. One of them is that in that role, he was a virtuoso. It was as though there was nothing he couldn't handle happily and competently. And he thoroughly enjoyed that role. And the other thing that really impressed me about him as a CS was his kindness. He wanted to be completely kind to the PC, to the auditor, and to the crew CS who had been handling that folder. And he would look for ways to help every one of them, whether it be through a comment he might write, or a cramming order, or an ethics order. It was all based on helping the PC get more gain or sort out a situation that he got into that was troubling him, and to help the auditor be a better auditor and help the CS be a better CS. It was entirely, completely positive.
I remember him always saying, where there's out ethics, there was always out tech before the out ethics.
Yes, that's correct. That's quite right. And he very often, when he took the crew folders into his own hands and CS'd those folders, it would be after there was a spate of ethics orders that had caught his attention. And something would spark his curiosity, and he'd call for the folders of the people who had been charged with this or that. Or it might have been a spate of people going to the medical officer. And if he found, he would go through 6 or 10 folders, and if he found out tech in a majority of the folders, he immediately had all of the crew folders on his desk or up in his office. So yes, I can completely agree with what you say, Janet.
Right, right.
Ken, let me ask you this, Ken, because you then became an auditor and you actually were processing people across from you, different than from receiving the processing yourself, right?
Yeah.
What kind of changes did you see pre-clears or people that you were processing? How did you experience those as an auditor as opposed to, getting the processing yourself? What did you observe, in terms of the pre-clears and the people that you were processing?
Well, the first thing you observe is that they get the wins that they get. And they behave when they're running a process, they behave in the way they behave.
Yeah, what I'm trying to ask is, did you see people change in front of you? Because when I did processing, that was what drew me to, I had gotten lots of auditing and I had changes, but what really sold me on it was when I was processing somebody else and you would see them change before your eyes. Did you have that kind of experience?
All the time. I mean, that's why you went into session.
Right.
And you didn't want to end the session until you'd had a session EP of one kind or another. Absolutely.
Now,
what?
And it made it rewarding too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, when you, as an auditor, Ken, you used an e-meter.
Yes.
Would you go solely off the e-meter or also go off indicators of the person in front of you?
You had to do both.
So you found the e-meter very useful?
Absolutely. Well, when you're auditing knots, it's absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I bring that up because one of our comments in an earlier interview, someone was asking about the e-meter and the results of the e-meter and how it worked and if it actually effectively was used in session to guide the session.
Right. Okay.
And then I want to follow up with that question about you see changes in people that you're doing processing on for the better, for the good, right?
Absolutely.
And you see L. Ron Hubbard acting in a caring way as a case supervisor and that type of thing. Okay. So now after all these years, how do you square that with, the stories about him, where he falsified his biography, where he was married to several, 2 women at the same time, where he didn't have a great relationship with his kids, where, all the different things that have come out about him. And, we knew, later after we got out, how do you square that up with the fact that there's this technology that you're delivering and it's delivering change with all these other things, people criticize him for, like the OT level stories and things like that. How do you square that now after all these years?
Okay. I'll answer that. I just want to go back a little bit and say that there could be times when the auditor has to give the PC's indicators priority over the meter.
Right.
Yes.
Now, as regards his different kinds of behavior, my view is that he wore different hats. His tech hat was one huge hat that he wore, and when he wore it well, he wore it extremely well. It was a hat I think he was born to wear.
I know he enjoyed doing that.
Yes. I saw that too, Janis.
Yes.
Yes. And I think, go a little bit off the subject. I think that what he set up in the organization is the HGC Qual ethics line. That organization is a manifestation just on its own of real genius that works so well. And to go back again a little bit, when I first started auditing knots in the flag HGC, I was very raw. I was a very raw auditor, and I would come across situations I had no clue what to do about, and I'd wing it. So then I'd find myself in cramming, and the people in the CSs and the people in cramming were very, very good to me. They were very patient. I was in cramming most days for a couple of months till I started getting the hang of things, of how you really organize yourself in a session. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so I learned how, and then I had a retread. I made 3 listing and nulling errors in a row. I was retreaded on listing and nulling. I never ever made a mistake on listing and nulling again, but it was a practical demonstration to me of how good that line is when it's well in. It's unbeatable, and it's a real genius to have conceived of that and put it into effect. Okay, so he had his tech hat, then he had his other hat. But I would look at it more this way. He had his tech persona, and he had his other personas. One of his other personas was, in my opinion, just from my pure opinion, was a showman. He loved being a showman. He loved, for example, when they had him lead some parade in East Grinstead. He was the marshal on his motorbike. He was in his element. I believe also that he was very influenced in that beingness of the showman. He was very influenced by Hollywood. And he was impressed by how well the actor could produce the image of being, well, think of Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler, the guy who was completely in control no matter what the situation.
Mm-hmm.
He's good looking, he's elegant, and he always has this nice smile, and he can swing on the rope across the stream and rescue the pretty girl. I think that spoke to Hubbard. I think he had a need to be kind of like that. And he became very good at what I would call plucking fluff from thin air. He could be talking to you, and suddenly you've got the impression about him that he was this or that or the other that was somehow wonderful. And he would do that to me when I was butler. I remember a couple of times. One time he was telling me how about he was going to parties in Washington, D.C., and there was just the inference that these were very, very posh parties with very important people, and of how gracious the hostess would be with him. Well, just can't prove anything, but you know, there were a lot of movies about that kind of thing, and I think he could go into that valence easily. There was another time he told me a story about how he was very badly injured during the war, and he came ashore and he was attacked by 3 thugs in LA or that naval place to the south, San Diego.
Oh, right.
In some kind of back lane. And he told me that they attacked him, he picked up a bottle and smashed it and just screwed it into their faces one by one. They all fell to the ground, and he called to the police, and the police came, and the police said to him, "Did you do that?" So I thought that was probably made up.
He was a good storyteller, right?
Yeah, he was very good storyteller.
He elaborated a lot on his stories, correct?
And I think he could elaborate on stories that showed him in a very special light.
Right. That's
So
kind of
that
what
was
I
part,
got too from reading his history in Barefaced Messiah. Ever since he was a kid and he wrote stories and he wrote books and he was a science
yeah,
fiction writer, he always elaborated it where he was the hero of the story, and
right.
there'd always be very elaborate stories.
Yes, yes. Well, I would always forgive him if he'd felt all his life that he was a special person with a special purpose, because he was, and he did have a special purpose, and he took a very roundabout way to find it, but he did find it in the end. And I don't hold it against him that he misbehaved on the way, because the
And
important thing is that he found it. He
right, and
found
then
his work.
also,
Yeah.
no, I was going to say also. So you believe that he truly believed? Like, we get asked this all the time. Did he believe what he was doing? In other words, did he believe in his technology and what he was doing? And I always tell people, absolutely. I never
Yeah.
saw him think that it was a bunch of crap.
Right. Well, I can tell you that I remember one day he did one of his lectures, one of his twice weekly lectures on the briefing course. He came back. I remember it was in the winter. It was raining heavily. He came back. I think I went to the lecture. I was allowed to. And he went to his desk, and he was kind of depressed. And he made some remark to me like he wasn't sure that he'd done the right thing, or that he really knew what he was doing, or that he was on top of things technically. And I thought this was complete rubbish. And I said, well, how came you to write the axioms, which are the basis of in my
Yeah,
opinion, the basis
yeah.
of all tech?
Mhm.
And they're spot on. They're wonderful things. So that cheered him up. If he had any other doubts about the tech, he kept them to himself. Let me go back. He had his tech hat. He had the showman hat. Then he had this kind of macho hat, which I think most Americans and most American businessmen, men of his generation, had, which was that you had to be very manly,
Mhm.
very tough, very clever, brave, inventive, creative. You had to be on top of everything all the time, and in charge and right. I think he was influenced by that, and that his experience in the military fed into that, because of course in the military you have to obey, you have to look on your senior as though he's always right. You have to obey
Right.
immediately. And I think he carried elements of all those things with him. There's another part of his persona that I would include, and that is his case. Now, in developing and putting out the technology of Scientology and pushing it out into society, he actually was disobeying, in my opinion, fundamental laws that govern how this universe works. This universe doesn't want the solutions that LRH was providing, because that lessens the power of the universe over us beings in it. So he was pitting himself against extremely powerful forces, and in my opinion, they got to him and re-stimulated parts of his bank. And he went into, or he went out of valence, I should say, becoming, well, he became the Commodore. He became the Commodore sort of military organization in which he was supreme. He could not be questioned or challenged. In theory, he had to be obeyed immediately. He was always right. He was never, ever wrong. He was in charge, and he was always on top of things.
And this was different to how he operated when he was at St. Hill?
Absolutely. He was at St. Hill. He was not authoritative. When he wanted to put his foot down, he put it down and it stayed down. But putting his foot down was not his daily basis of operation.
Right.
He was friendly, kind, respectful, courteous, always, and relaxed.
Do you think that he took on that Commodore persona that you were describing because of the different attacks and things that were going on in the various countries where they wouldn't allow him in, like South Africa and that type of thing?
I think that when he was thrown out of Rhodesia, that was one thing. And then he was thrown out of the UK, or rather he was refused permission to stay living in the UK. He wasn't actually thrown out. But I think when he found out that he couldn't regard use St. Hill as his home and his base anymore, of course it destabilized him.
Right.
What was he? He was losing all of his comm lines, or was threatened with loss of all his comm lines. His wife and his children had to have a new home somewhere. He had to provide that, and quickly. He had the clearing course and other ad course materials at St. Hill, and he was extremely worried that they might fall into the wrong hands. So I think it was a huge problem for him. And in that interbulation, I think he got really restimulated. And I think the great manifestation of that restimulation was the creation of the Guardian's Office and the first policy letters that set up and guided the Guardian's Office, the ones that hammered home the message that the best defense is aggressive. So he was setting himself up as an op-term, to use the old technical term. And when you set yourself up as an op-term, you're immediately in the bank.
An op-term, just for our viewers, an op-term is basically a term sort of like a force counterforce. It's something opposite, like this is going this way and here's an opposite terminal, an opposite pushing back. And so basically you're in a conflict with whatever it is, if it's a government or a person or whatever. That's what he's talking about when he talks about an op-term.
Yes. He put himself in a position of conflict with enemies that he could not win over. He took on a fight he could never win.
Right. Now that was
with like the U.S. government and the U.K. government and things like that, because they just were too big and too powerful.
Yes.
But that was also the same time period when he started coming out with the ethics conditions, the lower conditions of liability and doubt and enemy and treason.
Yes. Now, in my mind, there's a lot of wisdom in those things. You can use them. I think he made a little too much of them. I think they're very useful for an individual operating as an individual. But when you put them in and make them part of the operation of an organization, then it doesn't work well.
Right. It becomes abusive.
It became abusive, very abusive.
Right.
And it was abusive to begin with, in that the penalties for the lower conditions were kind of silly, but they were enforced. I mean, we at St. Hill, we were not in the Sea Org, but if we were put in non-existence, we had to sleep by our desks. we weren't allowed to go home.
Right.
So,
Completely silly,
yeah.
counterproductive.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Sleeping on the floor.
and
So
humiliating.
in other words, he was not infallible. I mean, we were supposed
I
to
don't mean
not question anything or whatever, but obviously not infallible.
his judgment could be very, very poor
Yeah.
because he was off track. There's a little quote I'll make you from the sayings of the Buddha. He said, amongst many other very wise things, he says, never neglect your work for another's, no matter how great his need. Your work is to discover your work and then to give to your work with all your heart yourself. Hubbard found his work and then he gave himself to others' work.
Yeah.
And went wrong
Yeah.
and didn't correct.
Right.
There was something else I was going to say. That's gone.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say on this subject? We're getting here towards the end, but I don't want to cut you off if you still have more to say about this.
Well, I think the only other thing I would want to say is that I repeat that what was my experience of him at St. Hill in the manor as his servant, and especially after doing the clearing course, I still feel that despite everything that happened since, L. Ron Hubbard is still the best friend I ever had.
Wow.
No question.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He went wrong. He went bad. But
Well, I look at it this way: nobody's perfect, including L. Ron Hubbard or anybody else. Nobody's perfect. Everybody's got, I say this all the time. If somebody discovers a cure for cancer, you're not going to care about whether or not he was married to two women at the same time and had numerous affairs. You're going to take that, okay? And a lot of people watching this, they don't understand exactly what it's like to be processed with the technology and the different gains and wins that can be had from it. And that's not me defending L. Ron Hubbard. That's just the fact. That's what happened in my life personally, and I can never disown that. I won't let somebody tell me, oh, you didn't really experience those wins. You didn't really experience those changes for the positive. And I did. So I can be critical of the man, and I can be critical of the organization, and I can be critical even of some of the technology, but I got a lot of gains out of it, and I'm never going to deny that.
Good, Mark. Good.
Yeah. How about you, Janis?
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, I grew up with it, so I didn't know anything outside, as I got my processing, but I felt I had wins. And when I hit power processing, I was happy. I didn't need anything else. I took years before I even had to do the clearing course or the other OT levels. I was totally content with power processing.
Yeah, and I'm the same way. My lower grades and all my lower auditing completely changed me as a person. You know what I mean? It got rid of a lot of phobias and a lot of things that I had going on with me, and it changed me as a person. It made me the person I am today. Whether or not people want to agree or believe the OT levels or anything like that, or the Xenu story and all that jazz, that's neither here nor there. I mean, a lot of that stuff is taken on faith. And but I had real wins in the different training that I did and all that. I just didn't like the abuses. I didn't like what Miscavige did, and there were things about Hubbard that really made me scratch my head because, like you said, Ken, he put himself out there as perfect. You know what I mean? I'm unquestioned. Don't question me. And I could see, you'd see these things. You go like, he's not perfect, but, oh, I can't think that now because I'm in Scientology. I'll get in trouble. But, being away from it and having my onion peeled, you can see the flaws, and we're not here to defend it. We're just here to give the stories and tell it like it is, the way that we saw it. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Okay. Thank you. Well, one thing I want to say is that he took on the work that he took on as his own was the work of a giant. And he, as I said before, he went into the teeth of the opposition that's embedded in the universe. But the fact that he took that job on is a sign of huge ability and courage. And the fact that they beat him down, is, well, it's a fact. They beat him down.
Yeah.
But he did something.
That's why we were on the move.
Right. Yes. But he did something that nobody else has ever done. And that is, in my opinion, his real important creation was the means of bringing about as-isness.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah. Okay.
That's one of the axioms.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had to, when I was a teenager, I did a course at a Scientology mission, and it was the axioms course, and you had to clay demo each of the axioms to a pass.
Right.
And it was one of the most amazing experiences I ever had in Scientology,
Right.
because the axioms are basically the basic truths that L. Ron Hubbard, quote unquote, discovered or whatever about the universe and that type of thing. And they're very spiritual. They're very intense. But
Yeah.
if you understand them, you understand then how auditing and how processing works and how counseling works,
Yeah.
I remember my mother having to learn the axioms and the factors verbatim.
Right.
Yeah.
I did too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anyway. Okay, Ken, we're pushing up against here. We appreciate your time and telling us all your stories, and also how your opinions, because they're valuable. Everybody's opinion is valuable. And that's why we here at our Scientology Stories, Peeling the Onion, we let people speak, and we also, try and chime in as well. But we want to thank you for being here as our guest, for another great interview.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure having you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, both of you. It's been lovely to speak to you and answer your questions. There is one other thing I want to say before we go, and that is that I do take responsibility for the fact that in my association with L. Ron Hubbard, I'd myself failed to take the responsibility I could have for his situation. I could see that he was in trouble, but I didn't find a way to communicate with him that I understood something of the situation and that I was willing to help him resolve things so that he could be happier. I didn't find that way. I just didn't know how to do it. And that led me into interpolation. And out of that interpolation, several times I misbehaved towards him quite egregiously. And I'm certainly not proud of that. But I have to admit that it did happen.
But, the thing is, somebody's got to be willing to accept, criticism and accept help. And from what I understand, Hubbard was always right in his mind. I don't know if he could be approached. You guys would know better. I never really had an interaction with him, but just like anybody, you can tell somebody, hey, stop taking drugs. But unless they really want to stop taking drugs, they're not going to listen to you.
Well, I know, I'm pretty sure that if I had said to a messenger, please tell the Commodore I'd like to speak to him, he would have called me in, or I could have just sent him a dispatch in his in-basket saying, I want to speak to you. He would have called me in, and I could have told him what was on my mind, and he could very well have blown up and thrown me into the bilges immediately. But I also know that the next day he could have called me up and said, you know, I've been thinking about what you said. He could have done that. That would have been very characteristic.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Ken.
Yeah.
And he had respect for you, obviously. He did have respect.
I never realized that until later. Years and years later that I realized that I had some ethics presence with him.
Right.
It never entered my mind at the time.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Well, thanks very much, Ken.
Okay.
Thanks, Janis. I would just want to remind everybody, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. You'll get great interviews like this and great stories. Just go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, of course. And if you want to join, become a member of our channel, just hit that join button, and that'll walk you through on how you can become a member of our channel. And we want to thank you, Ken, for being here. If anybody has any questions, you can also ask in the comment section, and we check it all the time, and we'll relay them. And Janis, is there anything else you'd like to say to Ken or before we leave?
Ken, it has been such a pleasure to get back in touch with you and do these interviews. And if we think of more interviews to do with you, I'm going to call you again.
Absolutely.
Sure. I'll be happy to. Thank you very much, both of you, for being so kind and considerate. I've appreciated it greatly. Thank you.
And we appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Until next time, everybody, we want to say, oopsie, I hit my mic. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.